Welcome to lecture number 10. In this lecture, we will cover CSS grids. So related to that, we will have an introduction to CSS grid, grid container, grid item, and properties for grid and CSS. Let's get started with introduction to CSS grid. The CSS grid layout helps the designers organize a web page. And they are really good at dividing the page into different sections and deciding how things like pictures or text can be placed and sized on the page. So it's a system with rows and columns, making it easier to design the web pages. So you can say that it's a two-dimensional layout system for the web and helps you organize your content in the form of rows and columns. So let's have a look at how a grid looks like. The grid looks like in the form of rows and columns, and we have certain things that are to be taken care of. So here the whole layout, that is the outer part, is called as the grid container, while these are called as the columns and these are called as the rows. And every specific item is called as the grid item. In other words, you can also say that every cell represents a single grid item. Now let's come to some important terms in CSS grid. The first one is a grid container. The grid containers contain grid items placed inside columns and rows. An HTML element becomes a grid container when the display property is set to grid or inline grid. This is very important. Without using the display property and setting it to grid, you will not get a grid container at all. So we must ensure that we have a div tag where we have a class attribute whose value is set to some class. So here we are writing grid container. Generally, we write grid container. It's a special term which we use in CSS grids, but really doesn't mean that you have to write grid container only. You can write anything. But we must ensure to use all the well-defined properties for CSS grids in the style tag. Rest you can write anything here, that is up to you. Now within this div tag, we can define as many div tags in order to define the grid items. But that we will see in the next slide. So here, what kind of style we need to apply, that is that this grid container should be set as display grid, or you can also specify display as inline grid. So both will work here. So defining this property will at least give you the outer structure of the grid, that is the grid container, but it will not consist of any items or rows or columns. To understand it deeply, let's come to the grid item. The grid items are the child elements in a grid container, and by default, a container has one grid item for each grid cell. Means every cell, or let's say each cell, will consist of one grid item. Let's take an example. We have the outer structure, that is the grid container, and we are including 6 div tags, that is we need to have 6 items inside the outer structure, inside this container. So we are giving the class as grid item. We can write anything here, but this is just a term that we use in CSS grids. And any content can be written here. You can place a text, you can place an image, but for simplicity, we are simply writing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we will perform a practical based on CSS grids. For this, we need to use certain properties for grid and CSS. The first one is display. So declaring display as grid will give you a one column grid, so your items will continue to display one below the other. This will create a one column format, and as many items you place within the container, those many rows it will create. Then we have grid template columns. This property specifies the number and also the width of column in a grid layout. Then we have grid template rows. This property specifies the number and the heights of the rows in a grid layout. we will first of all implement these three properties. So let's get started. First, we will create a div tag to which we will assign a class attribute, and the name we will give as grid container, which is the normal convention that we use, but otherwise you can use anything. Now within this, we need to create total 12 items. So I am already having these 12 items, as you can see here. So I have already created 12 div tags and gave them class attribute whose value is grid item. Okay, so we got these items on the web page, but we need to style them now. In order to style this, we need to come to head tag and write style tag, and we will use the grid container class, and we are now going to use certain properties. The first one that we will use is display property, whose value we are going to set it to grid. So you might feel that it has not affected this web page, but it actually has created a one column format and total 12 rows have been created. The effect you will come to know when we will use the grid template columns property. So grid template columns property will help us to create the total number of columns, and also we will be able to specify the size. Now for now, I will be automatically calculating the size of the width of these columns. For this, you can simply write auto. So if I am writing auto, it means it is creating just one column whose width is being calculated automatically as per the web page. So if I write again auto, it means that it will create two columns whose width is being calculated automatically. So as you can see here, two columns, width is automatic. But how many times we can write it? You can write as many times as you want, depending on the number of columns that are required by you. But one thing also need to be taken care of, that if you do not want it automatically calculated, obviously if it is automatically calculated, then the width will be equal for all the columns. But if you want an unequal width, then in that case, you can write down the value, let's say 80px. So if I need here 80px, I write 80px, then what it will do, for the first column, this is our first column and this is our second column. For the first column, the width it will consider as 80px, you can see here, while for the second column, it is taking the rest of the space, which is too much. So it means that whatever the leftover space is being occupied by the second column. Similarly, let's say if you need another one, I need 40px. Now it's a third column. So as many times we are writing, those many columns it will create. So you see that first column is 80px. The last one is 40px. I shall zoom in. Right. So zooming in actually will reduce the width. Okay, we can keep it here. So the first column is 80px, last one is 40px, while the middle one is, it is being calculated automatically whatever the leftover space is. Similarly, you can also specify this in percentage. Let's say I need 50% for the first one, and for the second one we need to consider it out of 100%. So we can say 50% and then 30%, 60, 70 and 80. So the last one we can consider either auto, or you can also write 20%. So you can see that the first column is 50% width, second one is 30%, while the last one is 20%. So hope now it's clear how to use grid template columns. So right now I'll be creating 3 columns but of equal width. So let's write auto, auto and auto. Now our next part is that let's style it so that we are able to see the things clearly. Right now it's not that much clear that what is the width and how much space it is occupying. So through the colors we'll be better able to know about it. Now for giving the style to the grid item, we are going to write grid item For the grid item, we are simply going to give background color and borders and some padding. So let's use background color. I'll be using as pink. So the background color is applied. Now let's give some border. Border I'll give, let's say 1px solid, and the color I'll take as crimson. So it has been applied. Next I'll give it some padding. Padding I'll take, let's say 20px, and further I'll also increase the size, that is the font size. In font size I'll take, let's say 40px. Yes, visible. And I'll also give it text align as center. Right. Now further inside the grid container as well, we are going to give a background color. Let's give background color as crimson. And right now it's not visible, but when we use the padding, then it will be visible to us. I'll give 10px padding. So you can see that the padding, due to the padding, we are able to see the border. A fine border is now visible to us. Right now we are having total 3 columns and 4 rows. The 3 columns, we have defined it ourselves in the grid template columns, but nowhere we have specified 4 rows. So how it is calculating 4 rows? It's because we are having total 12 items. So since we divided it into 3 columns, it is automatically taking 4 rows. So what is the purpose of grid template rows now? Well, specifying the total number of rows will not affect, because grid template columns itself will calculate the rows. Now grid template rows, you can specify the size. Size means that height. What is the height of the row that you want? Now let's say right now I want that my first row should be of height 100px. So you can see that it has slightly increased. Let's say if I increase it a bit, I shall write here 300px. So you can see that for the first row it has increased, while for the rest of the rows it is automatically calculated. But can we change for the rest of the rows? Yes. Because you are having total 4 rows, so 4 times you will have to write. So for the second time, let's say I need 50px. So you can see that the second row height is changed. Same way, you can specify the height for the third row as well as the fourth row. I'll just simply write here 200px. So let's only change the height for the first row. Now you might be thinking, what if we are having odd number of items? So let's check out this as well. Let me comment the last item. So can you see that still it is dividing it into 4 rows and leaving a gap in the last. So since we are not having the last item, that is why there is a gap. Now another thing is, what if you do not define the grid template columns? What will happen? So if you don't define the grid template columns, then it will by default consider the rows as the total number of items, while the total number of column will be just 1. So we are done with these 3 properties. Now next property is grid template. This is the shorthand property for grid template rows and grid template columns. Means that we will be able to use these 2 properties just once, and that too inside grid template. So let's implement this now. First we are going to comment these 2 properties, that is grid template columns and grid template rows. Okay, after saving you will find that it's the 1 column format and there are total 12 rows. Okay, now next is that we have to write grid template. We have to use this shorthand property. Now what is the syntax? In order to show the same output, the first part represents the rows. Now if you want to mention 200 pixel height row for the first row, then you have to write 200px for the first row, and then put a slash, that is divide symbol, and then write down how many columns do we want. So I need 3 columns, so you can write auto, auto and auto. You must observe that it's actually the same thing as we have written for grid template columns and grid template rows separately. So here we were having just one row. We wanted just one row to change its height. So that is why we have written only 200 px. And then put a slash. You need to specify what are the total number of columns. So hope this is clear. Moving on to the next property, grid row start. This property defines on which row line the item will start. You may want your item to start from a specific place. So you can specify that particular row where you want your item to start. Similarly, you also have grid row end. So this property defines how many rows an item will span or on which row line the item will end. So these go hand in hand, grid row start and grid row end. Then we have grid row gap. This property defines the size of the gap between the rows in a grid layout. So it will give some padding between the rows if you are using this property. Further, we have grid row, and it's a shorthand property for grid row start and grid row end. So let's implement all these four properties now. To have an understanding about all these properties, we need to assign a unique ID to one of our grid items. Let's say if I'm writing here item 1, because it deals with a specific item, a particular item. So let's say if I want my item number 1, that is this one, to start from let's say row 2, and I may want it to end till row 4. So let's try this once. So we have to specify the ID of our item, that is hash item 1, and here we are going to write grid row start. So first of all, I'll write grid row start, and I want it to start from the second row. So you can see that it has started from the second row, and 2 as well as 1, they have interchanged their places. Now next is that till where do you want this 1 to span. So first of all, I'll write grid row end, and there are two ways to specify this. One way is that till where do you want to end. This is the first row, this is the second row, this is the third row, and it's the fourth row. Let's say I want this one item to end till the start of the fourth row. So I'll write here 4. So when I write 4, it will be able to span 2 rows. Right. Next is another way to define the same thing is that you can specify how many rows do you want to span. So if you want to have the same result, you can write span and total how many rows do you want to span. I need to span total 2 rows. So write here span 2. And you can see that the result doesn't change because I am mentioning that I need to span 2 rows. So both ways it's correct. You can either specify till which row do you want to end, or you can directly mention that how many rows do you want to span. Both ways it will be correct. Next property is grid row gap. So you need to define some gap between the rows. Quite easy to use. Ensure that you are doing it within the grid container. So inside the grid container, you need to write grid row gap and specify, let's say 20 px. So you can see that the gap between the rows is now increased. You can increase it more, let's say if you need 30 px. So this way it's going to increase the gap in the between the rows. Next property is grid row. Grid row is a shorthand property for grid row start and grid row end. So right now one is starting from the second row and is spanning 2 rows. Let's comment these two and let's see how we can write the same thing using the grid row property. Inside the grid row, the first part specifies from where do you want to start. We want to start from the second row. Great. Now put a slash. Now till where do you want to end? I want to span 2 rows, or let's say you can in other words write that you want to go till the 4th row. Now let's write here 4th row. I'm writing here 2 by 4. It means that this one item will start from the second row and will end till the start of the fourth row. Okay, now let's see if I want to write span. I want this to span total. For the time being, let's write 2. So it means that the output doesn't change, means whatever we are writing is correct. Similarly, you can specify more number of rows that it can span. So it's a very useful property, and you don't have to increase the lines of your code. So if you want to use both grid row start and grid row end, you can simply use grid row. Now, just like these properties that we have done for the row, same way we have properties for the columns. So we have grid column start. This property defines on which column line the item will start. Then we have grid column end. This property defines how many columns an item will span, or on which column line the item will end. Then grid column gap. This defines the size of the gap between the columns in a grid layout. Then grid column, which is a shorthand property for grid column start and grid column end. It means that these two properties can be used together as a shorthand property in grid column. Then grid gap. This property defines the size of the gap between the rows and the columns in a grid layout. And it's also a shorthand property for grid row gap and grid column gap. Now let's implement all these properties. For grid row start and grid row end, we need to give ID to this item. And let's give it ID as item 5. Then inside the style tag, we'll write item 5 and give it style grid column start. Now it all depends. This item 5 is already inside the second column. Now if you want to give it, let's say, first column, I want it to start from the first column. So what it will do, it will replace this 1 with 5. So I write here 1, and you can see that 5 is now shifted to the first column and 1 has shifted towards the upper side. Further, if you want the grid column and let's say you want 5 to span till the third column. So if you write here 3, it means that you want it to end till the start of the third column. So that is why it will span 2 columns. Similarly, in the same way, you can also use grid column. Simply use grid column, which is the shorthand property for grid column start and grid column end. So it means that these two properties can be written in just one. So comment the upper two, and you need to write for the column, that is for the start, you need to write 1 and then slash, then 3. So you can see that it doesn't change. In the same way, you can also write that how many columns do you want your item to span. If I write here span, the result will change. So if you don't want to change the result, you need to write here span 2. Because you need to mention exactly how many columns do you want your item to span, and that is 2. Next property is grid column gap. To give the gap between the columns, come to the grid container and write grid column gap, grid column gap, and value you can mention, let's say I'm writing 40 px. So there will be a gap of 40 px between the columns. After this, another property is grid gap. Grid gap is actually a combination of grid row gap and grid column gap. Now, for now, you can comment these two properties and instead use the grid gap. Write here grid gap, and in order to specify the two values, you should remember that first place is reserved for the row gap while the second place is reserved for the column gap. So it means that I'll have to write 30 px space and then 40 px. So hope this is clear. Next property is grid area. This property specifies a grid item's size and location in a grid layout. It's also a shorthand property for grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and grid column end. Let's implement this practically. Let's say we want our item 1, which is right now in the column 1 and row 1. We want this to start from the third row. If we want it to start from the third row, we need to write, first of all, 3, grid area, and then write 3. So means that first place is reserved for from where you want to start in the row. Then you need to write on the column that in which column it should be. So I'm writing here 2. So can you see that my item 1 is right now in third row but column number 2. It has been shifted to column number 2. Now after this you can specify how many rows it can span or how many columns it can span. Put a slash once again. You need to write, either you can write down that till which row it can end or till which column it can end. Right now I'm using the span. So I use span. I need this to span 2 rows, so I shall write span 2. So this one is reserved for the spanning of rows. Then put a slash again. Now you need to mention that how many columns do you want it to span. So I'll write here span 2. So you can see it is spanning 2 rows and 2 columns. Let's say if I write here 3. So now it is easily understandable that because this is spanning 3 columns, it means that this place is reserved for the spanning of columns. So this is clear now. Next property is grid auto columns. This property sets the size for the columns in a grid container. Similarly, we also have grid auto rows, which sets the size for the rows in a grid container. So this property will set the width of the columns, while this property will set the height of the rows. It must be noted that these two properties will affect the size only when initially the size of the columns or the rows is not set. If it is already set, then these two properties will not affect. Or let's say for the columns or the rows for which the size is already set, they are not going to be affected, while for the columns and the rows for which size is already not set, they will be affected. So let's understand this with the practical. Right now you can notice that the first row's height is greater than the other rows. It's because we have specified here grid template property and we have written 200px for the first row. If you want to specify it for the second row, we can write another value once again and it will set it for the second row. But let's say this is not the case that we want. You could also write here auto, but auto will set the height automatically. So we don't have to specify the value here. But let's say you need a specific height for the row. Then in that case, you could write here grid auto rows, and let's say I need 190px for all the rows. So you can see that the height of all the rows is now increased to 190px except for the first row, which has been set automatically. Similarly, let's say if you are writing here just 10px, so it means that only the first row is 10px while all other rows are 190px. Now to understand the grid auto columns, we have this template. So I have commented each and every property which is related to a particular item. So these have been commented. And after this, we need to comment the grid template as well. Let's say if I'm commenting out this as well. So right now we are not having any specific size for a column. And by default, there will be only just one column. So you can see right now we are able to see just one column. And rows will be equal to the total number of items. Now since the size for this column is not defined, so now we can use the grid auto columns. and you can specify the size of your choice. Let's say if I write 50 px, so you can see that the size, that is the width of the column has been now set as 50 px. Next property is grid autoflow. This property controls how auto-placed items gets inserted in the grid. You can actually let your program decide using the grid autoflow that how you want to place your items, whether you want to place them column wise or you want to place them row wise. Let's implement this now. By default, these items are placed as row wise. Means if I write here grid autoflow as row, this will not affect it because the default value is always row. Now if you place here column, you can let this decide in the form of a column. So now your items have been placed as the columns. Next property we have is grid template areas. This property specifies the areas within the grid layout. And one last property that is a combination of so many properties, which is grid. It's a shorthand property for grid template rows, grid template columns, grid template areas, grid auto rows, grid auto columns, and grid auto flow. So all these properties can be simply defined within the grid property. For the grid template areas, I'll be now considering a very simple example. So let's consider the div and give it class as container, grid container. You can write anything, by the way. I'm writing a grid container within which we will have just 3 items. We are taking 3 items so that we can better understand the concept of grid template areas. Otherwise, it might be confusing for you to understand. So grid item, and the first item I'll need is 1. Then grid item, we have grid item 2, then 3. Now within this, we need to define the ID of all of these items. So first of all, I write item 1. Then we have ID as item 2. Then ID equals to item 3. Right, now let's style this. So for styling, we can come to the style tag in the head and write down the basic styling. So first of all, we need the grid container. Just display it as grid. Now it will be displayed as grid, and give it a background color. Background color I'll take the same, that is crimson. Then some padding. I need padding. Let's say I'm giving 10 px padding. Then I need to specify that into how many columns I want to divide my grid. So I'll just write grid template columns, and I'll just consider auto, and auto. Means I just want 3 columns. 3 columns are inserted. What next after this? After this, we need to style the grid item. That is, all the items will be given the same kind of styling. So I have specified the class as grid item. Then we need background color. Let's say it's pink. Border is required. Border I'll take as 1 px solid crimson. Then some padding is required. Padding I'll consider 20 px. And font size I'll take as same, that is 30 px. And text align center. Text align as center. We are now ready with the grid, which is consisting of just one row and 3 columns. To understand the grid template areas, we must give ID to all these items individually. To item 1, I'm giving item 1 as the ID. To item 2, I'll give ID as item 2. And while to item 3, I give ID as item 3. We can now actually refer to these items through their IDs individually, and we can let them occupy the area that they want. Now for this, come to the style tag and refer to all these IDs individually and give them some name. This name can be specified via the property grid area, where you can write anything. Let's say for now I'm giving A to item 1. You can actually write anything here. It's not mandatory you have to write A, B, C. Then to item 2, I'll give grid area as B. For simplicity, I'm just considering A, B, and C. Grid area, I'll write here C. So right now you don't go by the output because it's not the complete output yet. Come to the grid container and here write grid template areas. And now here we can specify our grid areas using A, B, and C for items 1, 2, and 3 respectively. And we can let them occupy the area that they need. Now here, let's say I want item 1 that is having grid area as A to span across 3 columns. Further, I'm also writing, let's say if I write B, C, and C. So can you see how the output changes? We are having 2 rows, means that we can have our first item that is A that can span across 3 columns. Then item B, that is actually item 2, which is having grid area as B, can span across just 1 column and is in the second row. Item number 3, having grid area as C, can span across 2 columns. You can similarly change the values here according to your choice. Let's say if I write here, I should write here B. And now the result should change accordingly. You can now see that B is spanning across 2 rows and A is in the first row spanning across 2 columns, while C is in the second row spanning across again 2 columns. Now the last property that we are left with is grid property, which we have seen is a combination of the other properties, that is grid template rows, grid template columns, grid template areas, grid auto rows, grid auto columns, and grid auto flow. So all these things can be specified in just one property. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's say if I'm not writing a grid template columns, I'm simply writing grid here, which is actually correct. Similarly, you can use other properties also in this grid property. CSS Grid is really a great concept that helps you to place your items in an organized manner on the web page. This video was for the basic concepts to understand the CSS Grid. You can take this to the next level by creating an image gallery. You can place your images in the grid items in place of the grid items and organize them accordingly. Now that we are towards the end of this lecture, these are the references. And this is the program link. That's all for this lecture.